If this is your first Parked at Home, if you've never participated with us before and don't know anything about our park, Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park, this is a map of our park. We are a park that spans two states, both Rhode Island and Massachusetts. We have six different sites in both of those states. And our primary focus is on the story of the American Industrial Revolution and how the Blackstone River Valley played a key role in the process of American industrialization. But of course, our story and the story of St. Croix and the story of the United States as a whole does not start with industrialization. It doesn't start with the founding of the United States. The history of this place and the people that have called it home goes back far beyond just the founding of our nation or the process of industrialization or even the process of colonization. We do have a really neat, we always try to draw connections, right, between our park and the park that is co-presenting with us. And so we do have several kind of unique, interesting connections that we can draw between our two parks. And I'm sure Karen, our guest, will talk a little bit about this. But one of the colonizers who arrives at St. Croix Island is a man by the name of Samuel de Champlain. And Champlain will actually visit what becomes parts of the Blackstone River Valley in 1606 as he's trying to create the map that you see on your screen here of New France, this part of North America that would become known as New France. So there's an interesting connection to be made there. But unlike St. Croix, which is colonized by the French at first, here in the Blackstone River Valley, uh, we were colonized by the English settlers. And one of those individuals in particular, the namesake of the Blackstone River, was an Anglican minister by the name of William Blackstone. William Blackstone arrives at first, settles up in what we would know today as Boston. He stays there for a little while until these people, maybe you've heard of them, called the Puritans, show up, and William Blackstone decides that he doesn't want to cohabitate Boston with the Puritans. And so he sells off his land and he makes his way into what he would have described as a wilderness. And eventually he will settle in what we know today as modern Cumberland, Rhode Island, very close to where the Ann and Hope, if anybody who's local, you may know where the Ann and Hope Mill is in Cumberland, Rhode Island. It's very close to the homestead that William Blackstone would establish along the banks of the river that one day eventually would bear his name. William Blackstone, like all of us, though, was mortal. He would die. The image on the left is a drawing depicting the grave site of William Blackstone. And then on the right side is a monument, a marker to the grave of William Blackstone. But anyone from the area will know that William Blackstone is not actually buried there. We don't know where he's buried. That's probably a story better served for another day. But William Blackstone, a key figure in those early years of colonization here in what would become the Blackstone River Valley. But although William Blackstone may have described the region that he moved into as wilderness, it certainly was not wilderness for the people who had long called this place home. The Blackstone River Valley, uh, from time immemorial, has been the home place for the Nahaganset, the Nipmuc, and the Wampanoag peoples. For thousands of years, their story has shaped and has been shaped by the location of the Blackstone River Valley. And certainly their story is a key part of the story of the Blackstone River Valley itself, and is still the home place for those people as well. In many ways, I think our parks share this story of a place being a home, a story of a place and its people, and the different people that have called these places home over the years. If we want to take it one step further and continue, I think, some of these interesting connections between our park, as colonization eventually developed, and then the United States became a country, and then industrialization began to take hold, really in earnest of the 19th century, even more people would immigrate to the Blackstone River Valley. And one particular group that would come to the valley really in earnest in the mid 19th century, in the middle of the 1800s, was French Canadians. So again, a unique connection, right? This founding of St. Croix Island and the French establishing a colony, and then 200 years later, these French Canadians eventually making their way, some of them, to the Blackstone River Valley as a new place to call home. Particularly around the time of the American Civil War, mill agents from the Blackstone River Valley would travel up to Quebec to recruit French Canadian mill workers. And many Quebecois viewed this offer as a really great short term opportunity, a way to move to the Blackstone River Valley to make some money to help sustain their family on the farm and then return back home. And that was the case for some. But for others, the Blackstone River Valley would become their new home. And many would move to mill villages like the one depicted on your screen here, eventually the city of Woonsocket in Rhode Island, or places like Manville and other mill villages all across the Blackstone River Valley. For these French Canadian communities, it became a process of they were very tight knit communities and wanted to attempt to preserve their culture. And two primary ways that they sought to protect their culture was through their faith and through their language. So here on this slide, you see on the left side St. Anne's Church in Woonsocket, a beautiful church that still stands today. Um, the church, the Catholic Church, becoming this center point for the French Canadian community, and the survival of their culture, of the French Canadian culture, as well as newspapers like Le Progrès on the right-hand side of your slide here, which was published in Woonsocket, which was published in the French language as well. So a survivance of the culture of French Canadians, even here in the Blackstone River Valley, in these mill villages. So the importance of a place to the people who call these locations home certainly is a connection that I think is shared in many locations, but I think is one that is especially shared between our two parks. And with that being said, I want to continue this theme of a French connection, if you will, here. And turn over the presentation this evening to our guest, Karen Magera. Karen Magera is a park ranger and educator at St. Croix Island International Historic Site. We're very excited to have her here to talk to us a little bit about her park. So, Karen, thank you for joining us. The virtual room is yours.
Thank you. You've actually given me an idea to have another topic here. The Maine Acadian Cultural Center is in northern Maine, and we're sort of loosely related to that. So I can see where we could certainly have some ties with that as well. But I am going to to you tonight about St. Croix Island and what happened here. So hopefully I am sharing my screen. Great. So good evening. As Mark said, my name is Karen Magera, and I am the Education Outreach Park Ranger at St. Croix Island International Historic Site. I got to get the right buttons clicked here. Sorry. Yes, I know. Well, there we go. I have to find the right screen. There we go. So we are a small park located in Down East Maine, which is just about as far east as you can get in the United States. We should probably be in the Atlantic time zone if that gives you any indication. We're located in the middle of the St. Croix River, and the St. Croix River is that boundary between the United States and Canada, or more specifically, even between the state of Maine and the province of New Brunswick. And I have worn many park ranger hats in my federal career. I started with the Forest Service and then Fish and Wildlife Service, and now the National Park Service with a break in there to teach high school chemistry. And much like I've worn many hats, so too has St. Croix Island. So one of the first hats was worn by the Passamaquoddy people. And much like Blackstone River Valley, The Passamaquoddy have been in this area since time immemorial, and they call the St. Croix River Valley home. Traditionally, the Passamaquoddy would visit the coastline during the warmer months and harvest fish and shellfish, and then travel inland to hunt some of the larger game like moose and bear during those longer, colder winter months. And it wasn't until the 1500s that we actually see the first Europeans in this area. We had Spanish, Portuguese, English, French explorers that all kind of went up and down the coastline, but there was not a permanent colony in the New World yet, except for the one in Florida that the Spanish set up. Nobody had really ventured this far north and gone inland at all until 1604. So 421 years ago, a group of men from France decided that this would be the perfect place to establish New France, or l'Acadie. They chose this area because it's on that same 45th parallel. So Maine, straight across the Atlantic Ocean, France, 45th parallel. Hopefully, they were thinking that the climate would be similar and maybe it would feel a little bit more like home. They left France this week 421 years ago, literally, I think Monday. And originally, I was supposed to do this presentation in March, and we had to reschedule. So I think there was some reason why we had to reschedule for this week, so it would be the anniversary. When they left, they knew they were going to go straight across the ocean. They really didn't know what they were going to find. And mid to late May, they arrived on the outermost shore of Nova Scotia and they worked their way along the coastline. They went into the Bay of Fundy, worked their way around, and eventually they wind up here at St. Croix Island in late June. The expedition is led by a man named Pierre Dugas, whose title is the Sieur de Mon. Also on this expedition, as Mark mentioned, is Samuel de Champlain. And he is a pretty famous map maker. He was charged directly by the king to create maps and write descriptions about what he saw. And not just here in St. Croix area, but in this one expedition, they make it as far south as Cape Cod. So there's lots of different maps and different descriptions that he made. Keep in mind, though, he is trying to convince the king and all of France really to send more money and more men. So his descriptions might be a little bit biased. Dugan knew that France could not finance this expedition. They had just finished a series of very expensive religious wars. And so instead, Dugas asks the king to award him an exclusive monopoly on fur trading here in New France. So he's going to finance the expedition by providing furs, especially beaver pelts, to make hats for all of Europe. They chose St. Croix Island because it would provide safe anchorage for their boats and it would also be easy to defend. So our island is only about 6.5 acres, and they felt like if they put a cannon on the southern end, they could look all the way downriver and watch for anybody that was coming upriver. They really weren't concerned about the Passamaquoddy. They had a pretty good relationship with the Passamaquoddy. They kind of exchanged information as far as what to hunt, what kind of plants they could eat. Who they were worried about were those other explorers. Both the English and Spanish explorers were known to come this far north, and now because of that monopoly, he had to worry about his own countrymen. So it was late June when they got here, and they knew winter was coming, so they got to work right away. Most of the trees on the island were cut. They built homes. They built a public house, carpenter and blacksmith shops, a bakery, and even two churches, one Catholic, one Protestant. So remember, they had just finished that religious war, so they needed to try to keep everybody happy. What they didn't have were gardens or a well. They had planned to, but the ground was too sandy to grow very much, and the water was too salty to drink. No problem. Shore is only half a mile away on either side. They could raise their wheat and their vegetables on the mainland where there was plenty of trees for firewood. And then there were freshwater streams for drinking water. All they had to do then was carry it by boat back to the island, a short half-mile little stretch. And that was great until the first snow fell. which happened on October the 6th. And I know we're in Maine, but even for Maine, October the 6th is pretty early. What the French didn't know was that it was bitterly cold and it lasted much longer than they anticipated, and they were not ready for the winter. By early December, they could actually see ice flows coming from upriver. So remember, they're relying on their proximity to the mainland to gather firewood and fresh water. Once the river froze solid, they should be able to just walk across the river. But the St. Croix River is tidal. What that means is twice a day, the water rises. Further upstream, the water would actually freeze solid, but then the tide goes out. All that ice breaks up, it travels downriver, and it creates a jam around the island. And eventually, they do become trapped on the island. Of the 79 men who stayed that winter, 35 perished from scurvy. And it wasn't until the Passamaquoddy brought fresh supplies in March that the men began to recover. Not surprisingly, they decided the island maybe wasn't the best choice, and they picked everything up, literally dismantled it, put it back on their ships, took it across the Bay of Fundy to what is now Port Royal, Nova Scotia. From there, Champlain uses that as a home base, and he travels up and down the coast. He goes further south from this area. He also goes up the St. Lawrence River, and he establishes Quebec City. And Quebec City is the longest continuously inhabited city of Canada. So he is actually considered the founder of Canada. Meanwhile, the British are trying to stake their claim in this area as well. 200 miles south of us, they established the Popham Colony. It was pretty short lived. They ran into some of the same problems that the St. Croix Island settlers had run into, except that the leader of that expedition died. And so it did not last very long at all. What it did do was provide a buffer between the British and the French interests. And this meant that the Jamestown colony, a little bit further south in Virginia, had that space to become established. So remember, St. Croix Island was 1604. Jamestown Colony, 1607. For the next the next century, this region goes back and forth between French and English control. Eventually, tension erupts into the French and Indian War, and the British push north. The problem is they don't have enough men to leave garrisons behind or to build forts. And so what they do instead is the French Acadians that are remaining in the area are required to swear an oath of allegiance to Great Britain. Those who refuse are forcibly removed. Over the next 10 years, more than 10,000 Acadians are actually removed. In the beginning, they are just shuffled a little bit further south to other colonies. They are also moved across the ocean to England and France, and eventually parts of the Caribbean. And some of those Acadians from the Caribbean make their way to Louisiana. And in Louisiana, Acadian was shortened to Cadian and then eventually changed to Cajun. So you might have heard of that. The Cajuns and the Acadians in this part of the world are all related. At the end of the French and Indian War, then, French essentially gives up all claim to any lands in this part of the world all the way to the Mississippi River. So St. Croix Island is now part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony under British control. And if you've been kind of keeping track of the timeline, you should know what's coming next. And you guessed it, it was the American Revolution. So skirmishes break out between the American colonies and Great Britain. Although the fighting didn't make it all the way to St. Croix Island, the first naval engagement in the Revolution actually occurred the next bay down from us in Machias Bay, and it was between the British sloop Margaretta and the American vessel Unity. And the Americans actually won that engagement. Finally, the American Revolution ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And St. Croix Island is actually a pretty important, has a pretty important role in establishing the new border of the United States. The St. Croix River is specifically mentioned in the treaty. Problem is, this river was actually called by other names, including the Scudic River, and there are at least 3 other rivers in this area that are also known as the St. Croix River. So which one is the real St. Croix River? To make things even more complicated, St. Croix Island has also been known by other names at one time or another. Dauché Island, Bone Island, Neutral Island. So there's a lot of confusion. And Americans. The British accuse of Americans of trespassing on British lands to harvest timber. Americans say that the British are trespassing on American lands and harvesting timber. Eventually, a commission has to be established to look into the matter. They actually turn to Samuel Champlain's journals, and it's his descriptions of the area that are going to determine which one of these rivers is the real St. Croix River. They make it to our island here in 1796, do some real basic archaeology, but they do find the foundations of what was probably the storehouse and enough other French artifacts that they were convinced that this was the St. Croix Island that Champlain referred to in his journals. Second hurdle then is determining where the mouth of the St. Croix River is located. The commission had identified 2 possible locations, and by the language of the treaty, there would be a line drawn from the mouth of the St. Croix River north and then one south. And depending on where that line was, one of those lines, one of those locations would place St. Croix Island in American waters, but the other would place St. Croix Island in Canadian waters. So again, they turn to Champlain's journals, come to the rescue once more, and based on his description, the mouth of the St. Croix River is placed at Joe's Point near St. Andrews, which is actually in New Brunswick. But it does establish that St. Croix Island is located in the United States. Whew, the matter is settled. We're in the United States. Or is it? Strange little sidebar. In 1896, the province of New Brunswick passes legislation that actually includes St. Croix Island within the boundaries of New Brunswick. Now we're Canadian, but it's a mistake. It also takes almost 4 years for them to amend that legislation. Sorry, our bad. It actually does belong to the United States. Shortly after that, St. Croix Island becomes part of the state of Maine when Maine becomes the 23rd state and joins the Union in 1820. Shortly after that, the Coast Guard establishes a lighthouse on the northern end of the island. And then now the southern end is kind of owned by a series of families and has some kind of interesting businesses, such as fish curing, sand quarrying, and a sort of public house of low repute. Fortunately, that no longer existed by the time St. Croix Island became part of the national park system when it was authorized as a national monument in 1949. 40 years later, it was redesignated as the St. Croix Island International Historic Site. And that was because of its cultural and historical importance to both the United States and Canada. And we are actually, as Mark mentioned, the only international historic site within the National Park Service. So here we are in 2025. What hats do we currently wear? Well, we are part of the NATO and the United States. Because of our International Historic Site designation, we fly the Canadian flag here. And every August the 15th, we commemorate Acadian Day. And the weekend before that is Passamaquoddy Days. So our conversation has come full circle. And when you visit the park and wander along our interpretive path, you can visit with Dugas and Champlain and the Passamaquoddy and listen to their stories about St. Croix Island. So thank you so much for joining us and learning a little bit about St. Croix. At this point, I will turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Karen. Awesome presentation. Didn't really know much of anything about St. Croix Island, so thank you for all of that. As always, we want to encourage folks, if you have questions about the park, definitely put those into the chat. We have had a few come in already. And one of the first questions was in regards to, you mentioned with the original settlement being on the island, the problems that they had, and eventually having to move to the mainland. And this question had to do with why did they choose what would become the Canadian side versus the United States side? Obviously, it wasn't either of those at that point, but why did they choose to go um, northeast, I guess, technically?
Well,
How
so
did they go in the opposite direction?
we're in the middle of the St. Croix River. And if you travel 5 miles south, then you're going to reach the Passamaquoddy Bay. The Passamaquoddy Bay empties into the Bay of Fundy. So they actually travel about 100 nautical miles from there across the Bay of Fundy to a location they visited on their way through. So they had actually stopped at this basin and kind of considered it as a potential place to start the colony, but kept going, thinking they would find something better. And they chose that location because of wind direction. So now they were back up in that basin a little bit and protected more from the wind. The north wind here on St. Croix Island, it just whips right up the river, and there's absolutely no protection. And of course, they cut down all the trees, so they didn't have any protection from that as well. So mostly it was to kind of it was on the west shore of what is now Nova Scotia. And so they were a little bit more protected from those winter winds. That was why they chose that location.
I feel like that's a tale as old as time in the sense of people show up, they decide, oh, let's build a house here. And well, why has nobody ever lived here in the first place, right? Why people chose not to live here? Maybe we should listen to the people who have been here and are not living there for a
Exactly.
reason, right? Um,
And this wasn't for lack of trying either, because once they decided that maybe the St. Croix Island wasn't the best location, they actually spent about 6 weeks. Champlain went further south, all the way to Cape Cod, looking for an appropriate location. And I'm not sure what was going on that he couldn't find. I don't know if they just didn't go far enough inland up some of those rivers to feel like they were getting into a protected a bay or further up the river, and again, protection was a big thing for them, trying to defend their colony from those other explorers.
right. And I guess it makes sense thinking from their perspective that like this is the same parallel as France. Hypothetically, you would think that it's similar weather, but there's this thing called the Gulf Stream which changes all of that. So, but it's interesting how
Changes a lot.
Maine is very different than France. I've never been to France, but I've been to Maine, and there
It
was
is. It
another.
is. Yes,
There was
and
another.
even other parts of the United States along the 45th is different.
True, absolutely, yeah. There was another question specifically having to do with the scurvy. What
Mm,
caused the scurvy,
okay.
and what led to the death of those 35 people as a result of scurvy, I guess.
Okay. So, scurvy is actually caused by a deficiency in vitamin C, which is found in all fresh fruits and vegetables. Ironically, they actually had enough to eat because they were able to raise crops, vegetables, wheat, things like that on the mainland before the snows came in and trapped them on the island. But what we know they predominantly had was bread and salted pork. And neither of those two things have any vitamin C. Of course, this is 1604. They knew what scurvy was, but they didn't know what caused it. They thought it was caused by bad air or laziness, or they had no idea that it was something that they weren't eating, which is why they started recovering in March when the Passamaquoddy brought them fresh supplies. It was something like 150 years before they actually discovered that it was a vitamin C deficiency that caused scurvy.
You mentioned as a result of that first winter that the Passamaquoddy had brought some supplies to the settlers there. So one person was asking what the relationship was like between the Passamaquoddy and the French when they first arrived.
hmm
And were those good relationships? It would seem if they brought them supplies that it was a positive, but what did that relationship look like?
Yeah. When they first landed, the Passamaquoddy were in the area. So during those warmer summer months, they were near the coastline harvesting shellfish and fishing themselves. And so they, I don't know if greeted is the right word, but they certainly came in contact with the French, had enough language in common or could pantomime whatever it was to communicate. And they actually did wind up taking, I think it was two, maybe brothers, but two Passamaquoddy further down the coast to use as interpreters with other tribes that had similar languages. The Passamaquoddy did tell them, "Don't stay on the island." Um, they, the Passamaquoddy themselves, never had a homes or anything on the island. They used it to store food to keep it safe from other predators, and so the French listened to a lot of what they said, just not the most important thing. And so once the Passamaquoddy went inland then to hunt game, and when they returned in the spring, started coming back in this direction, they took their canoes out to the island and took them fresh food and game at that point. So, yeah, very different relationship between the French and the Passamaquoddy than even the English and the Spanish had with the local peoples.
You had mentioned this relationship, right, that eventually would develop, and looking back to Champlain's examples and writings and maps
Hmm.
as determining this boundary. And I think that you mentioned that there was a kind of quasi archaeological exploration done on the island in 1796, I think was the date that you
Exactly.
mentioned.
Yep, yep.
Um,
Probably the first archaeological dig in North America.
wow. So there, that's pretty cool. So, someone was asking a question about a cemetery being on the island, and is there evidence of a cemetery, perhaps in regards to those 35 individuals who died in the original settlement? What can you tell us about archaeological work that's been done on the island since 1796?
So several examples, yes. There, let's see. I know there have been at least three different. The 1796 was really just to establish, was this St. Croix Island. There wasn't a whole lot of scientific trying to figure out what things were. And I know there were at least two other archaeological digs that have been done on the island. And yes, the 35 men that were buried there are still there. It's one of the reasons why we don't take tours out to the island. We're here on the visitor center and the path, and everything is here on the mainland. And the idea is that the path goes to the end, the overlook, so that you can look at the island from here. Um, I'm trying to think. I couldn't tell you when those were. I know it's been a while.
So as of
We
right now, there's not a lot of archaeological or none happening on the island
No,
itself.
no, 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 no archaeology going on right now.
So that sounds, can you talk a little bit about, and nobody asked this question, but you talking about how the park is set up, right? Kind of brought to mind. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like to educate people and talk to people about that story at the site where you're looking at the island? And it sounds like with the statues that you have dispersed along the trail, like that's an interesting and thought-provoking, I think, way to talk about a history that's no longer visible in a way, right? You can see the island, but
Hmm.
there's no tangible evidence that you can see, it sounds like, from the shore of any houses or buildings that were there in the original settlement. So,
Hmm.
what is that like, educating and interpreting in that way about something that was there and is not physically, you can't physically see the remains anymore?
It can definitely be challenging. We have visitors who pull into our parking lot and ask if they're on the island. We're close enough to Acadia that, and Acadia being on an island, that people are used to just driving and driving. Oh, now we're on an island, and so that's kind of understandable. But the statues do they're very lifelike. They were based on real people. We have two Passamaquoddy statues who were based on Passamaquoddy models. And so they are extremely lifelike. And the interpretive panels that go with each one of the statues actually feature that statue in the panel. So it's this really neat. it just tells the story in such a great way as you walk from the visitor center and you get a little bit closer to the overlook. And then when you arrive there, now you have a map of the settlement itself that you can look at, and then kind of look across the water and realize that that half mile, and the fact that they were trapped there for almost 4 months, and it looks like it's just right there. Um, we also encourage people, if they are able to, if you could see through the island to New Brunswick on the other side, there's actually another international historic site, and the Canadians have it's kind of a rest area on that side of the world that have interpretive panels as well. And because they dismantled everything on the island, I mean, literally took the buildings with them. If you travel to Nova Scotia to the habitation, it's that has been recreated. So if you went there, you could really get an idea of what the buildings here at St. Croix look like. And so a lot of our Canadian visitors that come in, um, they have seen. We talk to a lot of people who've been there and can kind of go, oh, okay, now I understand those buildings, this island, and it's 6.5 acres, so it's really easy to just kind of wonder why this island, and all of, I mean, the number of buildings that were in this small spot here, so.
Right. What is that? So, there was another question about like what else is there to see in that area. So, mentioning that, like that sounds like a really cool thing. If you can travel internationally and go across the border and check out that site, are there any other sites within close proximity to St. Croix Island that can help people to better understand the story besides that site, I guess?
Mhm. So, we are about 7 miles from Calais, and Calais is the main city that is the kind of the gateway to New Brunswick. St. Stephen is the Canadian city, and their sister cities, and so that's where you cross the border. Um, right there on the river in Calais is the Wabanaki Cultural Center, and the upper floor is actually a main visitor center with brochures for all over the state for people entering into the country and into the state of Maine. But the bottom floor is actually dedicated to Wabanaki peoples, of which the Passamaquoddy are one. And so there's from that perspective, there's more to see there.
Very cool. Um, since we're on the topic of talking about the indigenous people in the area, and the Passamaquoddy being one, there was a question about, do the Passamaquoddy still visit the island? Are there allowances for plant and animal harvesting or ceremonies? What is that relationship like today?
Mhm. So the Passamaquoddy Days, which I mentioned in the presentation, is actually in August, and members of the tribe actually make a journey by canoe from Princeton. It's about a 2-day journey, and they used to actually spend the night on halfway between on St. Croix Island. But launching the canoes and trying to spend the night there became difficult, so they actually stayed just a little bit upriver from us at an area called Devil's Head. And but we try to always be at the end of the overlook there when the canoes come through, and we've had Passamaquoddy that are supporting the canoers that come and use our site because you can get right next to the water pretty easily. We've had drummers in the past that sing and drum as the Passamaquoddy go by. um, let's see, there's actually two reservations really close by, and they each have a school, so we do school programs here. There's a specific class at, I think it's the Pleasant Point. The Sabayak tribe actually came out earlier. I think it was November of last year, and they did a water ceremony. And so they took water from the St. Croix River and had their ceremony, and then returned the water back to the river. And so and they included me in it. It was a really very neat experience to be included in. So yeah, they're pretty open to coming here. And again, there was really never they didn't have homes or anything on the island. In fact, their name for St. Croix Island means out of food place. And so it's there's not it's not like it's a place that they wanted to live in again, or have traditional things. It was mainly a place to store food, from what we've heard.
Very interesting. So you mentioned, I'm thinking of like my visits to Maine and how the tides are incredible in certain parts of Maine where, there's that island in Bar Harbor that I think of, right? Why
Hmm.
it's called Bar Harbor, right? And you can literally walk out at certain times of the day. Um, and certainly with changing climate and things like that, are there any steps someone wants to know? Are there any measures being taken to protect the island from sea level rise, or is that even a concern at this point?
Really, of more concern are the increasing ferocity of the storms. So there is a real sandy bluff. I think I mentioned that one of the things that they did before it became part of the National Park Service was sand quarrying. And there is actually a bluff on the island itself that's losing a lot of sand every year. And some of that is normal tide coming in, coming out. But with these increased winds, increased storms, the severity is just so much larger that rate is definitely increasing. There was a commission that has been studying that and using nature to kind of fix that problem. And one of the things that was proposed was to actually build artificial nubbles. And so nubbles are a cool thing up here. On St. Croix Island at high tide, it looks like it's actually three little islands. But at low tide, you can tell that they're all connected. And so those two little pieces that stick up above the water at high tide are nubbles. And as the water comes in, it kind of breaks the force of the water around the island. And so by putting some more artificial nubbles out there, we might be able to slow that force down and decrease the amount of so that's one of the things that's been proposed.
Well, we won't think of these days. That sounds really cool though. Um, so talking about specifically, you mentioned, it's an important part of our story here in the Blackstone River Valley too, the French Canadian culture and the spread of French Canadian culture. Someone was asking, excuse me, my allergies have been so bad lately. Um, are there any connections with Creole culture today in New Orleans? With that part of Maine, do we see any kind of carryover in food or music or anything like that, that kind of cultural connections between places?
So at the end of the French and Indian War, the Acadians were allowed to return to this part of the world. Problem was, it's been 10 years, and the British that were in the area kind of came and claimed those lands because they were, the farms were already um, had already been cleared. It was easy. And so the Acadians, most of them did not go back to what they considered their home. Here in this part of the world, most of the Acadians that are in the United States are in northern Maine. There's a large group there, and then just over the border, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland are a big area for Acadians. The have I actually went to college in East Texas, fairly near Louisiana. And I can tell you that although they came from the same ancestors, the culture is kind of different. The food, the music, everything, because of that Creole influence in Louisiana, Cajuns have a different culture than the Acadians in this part of the world. They're definitely related and sympathetic to one another, I suppose, but still pretty different.
So, if someone were to visit, right, what are I'm planning a visit this summer. What are some insider tips or tricks that you could offer to these folks that would make for an awesome visit to St. Croix Island International Historic Site?
Well, we are closed on Tuesday. Well, okay, let me start this way. The park itself is open daylight hours every day of the week. But if you want to, and so you could visit the interpretive path and walk to the end and visit the statues and see the island from the shelter at the end of the path there. But if you wanted to come inside the visitor center, we do have some a petroglyph display. We have a kind of a touch table with artifacts and things in it. Of course, we have the bookstore, and Our visitor center is open Thursday through Monday, and that is 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. We also have the passport stamp, of course. If you're an avid NPS visitor, then you probably have one of the passport books, the NPS passport books. Sometimes that gets confused with the passport that you need to go into Canada. Don't stamp that one. uh, but we do have the National Park Service passport book that you can have stamped here. Um, if we are closed, there's usually a kiosk out front, so you can still get your stamp and you can still do your Junior Ranger badge to that direction.
Mrs. Mello would be very happy to know that there is a passport stamping station. It's one of her favorite pastimes. On that line, are you folks open in the winter? Was a question that just came in, and I think that's kind of related to that.
Yes and no. So again, the park is technically open daylight hours all year long. The problem is snow, and we are on a pretty decent hill. So the parking lot gets a little treacherous, and we do at times close the gate at the top of the hill. So you can still walk in. The visitor center is only open from Memorial Day through Columbus Day. And then the other thing that we are doing is that we have protective covers around the statues that we put on usually around Thanksgiving. And we're just now getting around to taking them off. We're kind of, like I said, we had snow on Monday. So we have to, the ground has to dry out enough for us to go take those off. So definitely we'll have them off and ready to go before Memorial Day. But winter can definitely be a little bit challenging trying to see it. So bring your snowshoes.
Winter in Maine, I think challenging is a good way to describe a winter
Yes.
in Maine. As kind of just a final question for you, I'm sure with such a rich and deep history that the site clearly has, what has been the most meaningful interpretive educational experience that you've had with with folks at the site?
So this was a very different experience for me. I have a natural resources background. And so this was my first foray into the history side of things instead of the natural resources side of things. And I have enjoyed the stories. I keep falling down rabbit holes. That's what my boss calls them. So even like looking for this presentation, the like that strange little story about New Brunswick passing legislation that now suddenly St. Croix Island is part of New Brunswick for 3 years. What is this all about? And just my poor husband, I probably bore him with all kinds of stories that he just doesn't, he knows more about St. Croix Island and this part of the world than he ever thought he needed to know. And then, of course, I was hired specifically to kind of create an education program. And so my job for the last, probably good 12 months has been to go into the schools. And my favorite program right now is one called If the Statues Could Talk. And so we have 4 volunteers that don't know what they're getting into that stand in front of the class, and we have them put on props so they look like one of our statues here. And then I usually read a little story that kind of goes with that specific statue. And so they don't know that there's like one of the students gets to wear a little baby carrier and wear the moccasins, and somebody else has a really fancy hat and a sword. And so they really get a kick out of that. And it's another way to kind of bring those statues to life to tell that story. So that's one of my favorite programs.
That sounds awesome. I want to participate in that program. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Well, if you come and visit me, I will get you dressed up. We have the full Pierre Dugas costume. I will get that out for you if you come visit us.
I will have to take you up on that offer. I have family, I think I've mentioned this to Karen before, that live up in sort of in that area. So this is definitely on my list. Maybe this summer we'll make our way up there and visit, and I'll hold you to that. We'll take pictures and we can share it with all of our Parked at Home friends here. I'm sure
Oh,
everybody will get a
certainly.
kick out of that. Well, Karen, sincerely, thank you so much for joining us this evening. That was a fantastic presentation. Some great questions from folks. Thank you for taking the time out of your week to be a part of the Parked at Home series. And thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. I thank you for asking us to join.
Of course. And I do want, because this is our last program, I do want to provide a conclusion, if you will, for the 2025 series. So, 5 weeks ago, if we can all think back to that moment, that I can barely remember because it was 5 weeks ago now, but we started our presentation with Rocky Mountain National Park by talking about the idea of a photograph and the idea that uh, a picture in many ways can tells us 1,000 words, right? But more importantly, a picture can tell us a lot about the person who took the picture. Maybe in the months ahead, you'll visit some of these places that we've virtually visited here in this series, and you'll have an opportunity to take photos of your own and to take stuff from those sites, ideally not tangible stuff, right? That's illegal. We don't want you to take stuff from national parks, tangible things. But maybe you will take some intangible things away from your visits to these places. And maybe one of those things will be a photograph. And when you look at that photograph that you take of these places and you think about how national parks can mean something different to everybody, right? Some places can be a place of rest, restoration, healing for people. Other places, other locations in the National Park Service may be a place of contention, confrontation, or even may bring about anger out of a person. Happiness, sadness, joy, and defeat. Every individual place can mean something different to every person who visits those places. And in the end, I think that that's kind of speaks to the National Park Service as a whole. If the National Park Service is, as some call it, America's greatest idea, it is America's greatest idea because of the individual places and the stories that those places tell that make those places special to us collectively. So we hope you'll get a chance to visit these National Park Service sites in the next few months or years and take your own pictures of these places. And if you look at that photo after you take that picture, you might be surprised what that photo tells you about yourself. Thank you all so much for participating in the Parked at Home series with us over the last 5 weeks. This is always, we don't just say this, I know Allison and I say it all the time, but we sincerely mean it. It's always an honor and a privilege when we get to present presentations and programs like this to all of you. And it's something that we sincerely look forward to. And we hope that we will see all of you again next year in 2026 for Parked at Home 2026. But for now, enjoy your summer, enjoy any trips that you're all going on, and we hope to see you all soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great night.